With a majority of Americans taking at least one medication every day, we're no strangers to prescriptions. But what happens when the medication you need isn't offered in the right dosage, or you're allergic to a binding ingredient in the FDA-approved drug? That's when you call a compounding pharmacist. While FDA-approved products are always the first choice of treatment, these specialists are able to create a new version of the drug that fits a patient's specific needs.
An instance in which they might not be appropriate is, say, if a patient is a child and can't swallow a tablet. The only approved medication is available in a tablet, so the pharmacist can custom formulate it into a liquid version for the child to take. Another instance might be if a patient needs a different dosage form than what's commercially available, or a different route of administration, or they're allergic to an excipient. And a lot of animal drugs are compounded. There's not that many FDA-approved drugs for animals that can treat the range of animal sizes that exist. So from tiny kittens to giant elephants, compounding pharmacists are able to formulate medications to treat all of those different species.
That's Tennille Davis, Chief Advocacy Officer for the Alliance for Pharmacy Compounding. As a compounding pharmacist herself for 16 years, Davis says it's the avenue for patients when there are no options left. That could be due to an allergy, like she mentioned, but compounding pharmacists also come into play when the FDA-approved drugs simply aren't available.
When a drug goes on the FDA's drug shortage list, a compounding pharmacist can come in and essentially create what's called essentially a copy of that formulation to treat a patient. We've seen that a lot in the last couple of years when really popular GLP-1 drugs were on shortage. A lot of compounding pharmacies were able to fill in that gap for patients.
Compounding pharmacists are nothing new. In fact, before there were mass-produced pharmaceuticals, your local pharmacist would be the go-to for any treatment needed.
The town doctor would say, oh, this patient needs tincture of whatever. And the pharmacist would say, okay, I have these bulk ingredients. Let me mix up tincture of whatever for this patient. And that's essentially compounding at its root. And then kind of as processes became standardized through industrialization and there's an explosion of different medications available, the medications began to be produced in mass. And so pharmacists were no longer having to do compounding all the time. They were having to dispense previously manufactured pharmaceuticals.
That's Dr. James Watson, an emergency physician and medical toxologist at Maine Medical Center. He says that this shift in the pharmacist's role was amplified even more in the 1930s. A product called Elixir sulfanilamide was made as an antibiotic, and since it was for kids, it had a raspberry flavoring added to it.
It turns out when you take the raspberry flavoring and you take the sulfanilamide and you put them together, they don't dissolve into a liquid. And so you need a diluent, something that you can mix those two things in so that it'll dissolve. And so they chose this thing called DEG, which turns out is incredibly toxic. People maybe had the beginning of an understanding that it was toxic at that time, but my understanding of the narrative is that it was a genuine mistake and not, just not understanding this was a toxic thing to be mixing the medication in. But at that time, there's no kind of FDA oversight of pharmaceuticals. And so they didn't have to do any testing, safety testing, animal models, anything like that. They just kind of mixed this batch up and then they distributed it nationally.
Just over 100 patients died. It was one of the most impactful mass poisonings of the 20th century. Because 1 year later, Congress passed the 1938 Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. At its core, this law requires proof of a drug's safety before being released to the public. However, while this gave the FDA oversight of pharmaceutical companies, it didn't include small compounding pharmacies.
That was a very different type of practice than bulk manufacturing pharmaceuticals. And so there was no kind of realization or insight at that time that the FDA would also need to oversee these people who are doing kind of bespoke one-off compounding. But then as we move through the middle into the second half of the 20th century, there are a variety of different kind of advancements in medical practice that led to the need to compound more frequently and in larger quantities.
Cardiac surgery is one example of this. New medicines were needed to temporarily stop a patient's heart during surgery, but those weren't yet being manufactured on a large scale.
And so they would look to compounding to put together these specific formularies, or TPN, total parenteral nutrition, for people who can't take food by mouth and need to get food injected into a vein. So that started to have to be compounded. The idea of people going on long-term IV antibiotics, chemotherapeutics, things like that through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so all of a sudden, there were more and more people who needed these kind of custom made or slightly alternative formulations of medications. And so pharmacies started to make things in bulk, right, in batch.
But these larger operations soon caught the attention of the FDA.
In the 1990s, in 1997, there was the FDA-MA, or Food Drug Administration Modernization Act, and that essentially said that the FDA was going to have expanded regulatory role over compounding pharmacies. And they were going to take compounding pharmacies that, kind of adhere to certain criteria that just stick to doing bespoke stuff or promise they're not going to try to market like a wonder drug to the nation without, any of the regulatory oversight processes. As long as pharmacies promised that they weren't going to do that, then they could adhere to lower standards.
Watson says these expectations created a gray area that ultimately set the stage for a pivotal moment in 2012. At the time, the New England Compounding Center was registered to make patient-specific prescriptions, but in reality had been shipping drugs in bulk across the nation for more than a decade without any FDA oversight. One of these products was a steroid designed to be injected into the spine to treat pain and inflammation.
And it turned out that methylprednisolone was contaminated with fungus, and it led to an outbreak nationally of fungal meningitis.
The United States Attorney's Office reports that around 800 people were affected, and more than 100 patients died as a result.
Because of this murky regulatory space that everyone was operating in, the FDA was able to do walkthroughs, but they had no real enforcement power, which was handled more by the state boards of pharmacy. And so in the trials that came after of New England Compounding Center, it came out that the FDA had actually investigated this facility 3 times and identified issues with their sterility, but they weren't able to enforce anything or issue any penalties because there was this contest over their jurisdiction.
The public outcry in the wake of this disaster led to the Compounding Quality Act in 2013. It basically split compounding pharmacies into the 2 groups we have today. The small, bespoke pharmacies are regulated under Section 503A of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, while the larger, bulk manufacturing facilities operate under Section 503B.
Essentially, the smaller 503A are state licensed pharmacies. They're primarily regulated by state boards of pharmacy. There are FDA rules they follow, but their primary regulators are state boards, where 503B outsourcing facilities are primarily regulated by the FDA. The 503B outsourcing facilities make larger batches, typically of drugs in shortage that are sent to hospitals and clinics, rather than treating one patient here and there, which is what 503A pharmacies.
The difference in oversight mainly stems from expectations that 503A pharmacies are only creating a medication when a prescription comes in for a specific patient.
And so they would take that prescription and say, okay, I'm going to mix this up for this patient once I receive the prescription. They're not allowed to anticipate that a prescription is going to come for that patient and make it in advance. They can't anticipate that they're going to get a variety of these prescriptions for different patients and make them kind of in bulk. They have to do it kind of one for one.
Davis says that the FDA still has a little oversight on the smaller operations. For example, though compounded drugs are not FDA approved, the drug powders used to mix compounded medications have to come from FDA-registered facilities.
They have to come with a valid certificate of analysis. And most state boards of pharmacy have adopted what's called the USP, or United States Pharmacopoeia chapters on compounding, which is a standard that's set by USP about what goes into compounded medications. So that legal requirement is set by state boards of pharmacy, not by the FDA, to follow those USP standards, which cover everything from training to cleaning to monitoring to testing, all of the things that go into creating medications.
On the other hand, 503B pharmacies have to adhere to current good manufacturing practices and are inspected by the FDA. Despite this update in regulatory oversight, Watson says it's still somewhat of a patchwork system where things can fall through the cracks.
People make mistakes, and if you're not going to be upheld to the same regulatory expectations, that you're not going to get the same level of oversight. Standards can slip. I'm not saying that they do necessarily, but mistakes can happen. And it can be something as simple as, there's a case where somebody was getting acid blocking medicine compounded for them, and it had to be mixed with something called bicarbonate. And it turns out that bicarbonate and baclofen, which is a heavy sedative, sit next to each other on the shelf. A simple error of grabbing baclofen instead of bicarbonate led to that patient receiving baclofen, which led to hospitalization and bad clinical outcome. So, that's a human error, right? Humans are expected to make errors, and there need to be systems developed to accommodate that and account for the inevitability of human error.
Watson compares this expectation to how we view doctors. It's understood that physicians may make a medical error, so there are systems and safety standards in place to protect patients.
In an ideal world, there would be equivalent regulatory oversight from the FDA applied to outsourcing facilities and bulk compounders, as is applied to, any of the big brand name pharmaceutical companies who are, making pills or IV solutions en masse. I think that's kind of the gold standard, and we should strive towards that.
But that's a difficult task, especially when the FDA's resources are already being spread thin. Still, that doesn't mean we won't get there one day. Pharmaceutical compounding is a crucial part of healthcare, and making small improvements over time will eventually build a system that has the most protection for consumers.
I think that compounding is necessary. It's absolutely necessary. An incredible number of patients really benefit from having medications compounded for them. This is a necessary industry. It's not going anywhere, nor should it go anywhere.
You can find more information about Tennille Davis, Dr. James Watson, and all of our guests on our website, radiohealthjournal.org. Our writer-producer is Kristen Farah. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. I'm Elizabeth Westfield.